Welcome back to Why We Buy It. My name's Cobe, and today I want to talk about something I've gone ahead and done that I've been stressing about doing for quite some time. And this is another video for my watch enthusiasts out there because over the last few years, I've been looking at vintage watches off and on. And there are a number of vintage models that I'm so very interested in, but I had yet to pull the trigger on a vintage watch. Because if you've seen some of the watches I've reviewed on this channel, and if you know me and if you've seen me wearing certain watches for my collection, you'll know that I keep all my watches pretty much immaculate, right? I try to keep them in absolutely as new shape if I can. They'll get the odd little scratch here and there because it happens, and quite often the watches I purchase are high polished models, so they're prone to that, but generally speaking, I keep my watches mint. And that's really what's kept me from buying a vintage watch. But recently, while looking over some local auctions, and there was an estate auction happening with a number of old vintage items in it, I came across one of the watches that's on my vintage list. And the opportunity to get it at a pretty decent deal was too much to pass up. Even though this watch is not in the best condition. I mean, when it comes to buying vintage, you know, the two adages are buy the best you can and buy the seller. In this case, I was buying from a random auction, so I'm not buying the seller. And it wasn't the best condition, so I wasn't really buying condition. I was just buying a deal, and it was enough for me to get into vintage watches and kind of break that vintage watch seal. Now that I've done it, I'm looking for more. But is this particular watch I'm wearing today, is it going to prove to be a smart purchase, or am I going to regret it? And this will end up being a two-part series because I've had it now for a few weeks and I've worn it quite a bit, and I've taken it to where I generally take my new watches to get serviced. And I've opened it up and I've looked at a few things and I've tried the functionality and all of that. And I'm kind of on the fence about whether or not this was the right way to go. And I won't know that until later. So I will do a second part to this video, but during this video, we'll discuss my initial impressions, why I chose this particular watch, a little bit of the history of this actual watch, and what I like and what I dislike so far after buying my first vintage watch about purchasing vintage watches. Let's get into it. Now, before I reveal which watch I actually purchased as the first vintage watch in my collection, I want to talk a little bit about the history of mechanical alarms and watches. And it begins in 1947 with the introduction of the Vulcan Cricket, which is still being made today, although did have a hiatus, so to speak, during the quartz crisis. But they were the first ones to create a mechanical alarm within a wristwatch. And it was so popular, in fact, that American presidents kind of became enamored with the idea of having this little alarm clock attached to their wrist. And that's one of the reasons why it's such a famous model till today. The second to do it was actually Jaeger-LeCoultre. And Jaeger-LeCoultre only did it a couple of years later, the release of their Memo Box model. But in 1956, they actually produced the first automatic wristwatch with a continuation of that Memo Box model, and it had a bumper movement in it. Now, the limitations to that was bumper movements, especially at that time, were inherently noisy and you could feel them sort of rattle on your wrist. And when mechanical alarms are not only audible, but more importantly, you feel them. So the real reason they work is because you can feel the mechanism activating on your wrist. When you use a bumper movement, it kind of works against that. It was a decade later that Seiko introduced the Bellmatic, and the Bellmatic was the first fully automatic with a 360-degree bidirectional rotor so that you would not feel the motion on your wrist as much. And that's actually the model I went with. I went with the Seiko Bellmatic. Now, the Staple Bellmatic was made between 1966 and I believe the last models were in about 1978 or somewhere around there. Basically, leading into the quartz crisis and with the advent of Seiko and the quartz alarm wristwatch, they dropped the line entirely. And it's never come back. Whereas Jaeger-LeCoultre still makes the memo box. And like I said, Volcane Cricket, they brought that back as well. This is completely discontinued, at least for now. And in the 60s, with the release of the Bellmatic, we're talking about a movement that, although visually looks a lot like the Volcane Cricket, doesn't work at all mechanically like a Volcane Cricket. But the early 60s models, so from 1966 to 1969, maybe 3/4 of the way through, you have this design with a 27 joule movement. This is a 69 from June of that year. It's very easy with Seikos to look when the manufacturing date is because of the serial numbers. So this is June 69, and it was something like September or October of 69 that they switched to either a 21 joule or 17 joule movement. And the reason for doing so is because anything above 21 joules at that time was considered a luxury item and would face a luxury tax in the United States of America primarily, which is, of course, one of the biggest markets. So they started to produce these lower jouled movements in order to keep a significant interest and exposure to the American market. But this is one of the ones that's previous to that, and that's also one of the reasons why I was attracted to it. I was attracted to the alarm function. I was attracted to the fact that it's not made anymore. And I was attracted to the fact that in the 60s, you get that 27 joule movement. And the movement itself is very impressive. I'm not going to get into it right now because I want to show you all the functions and features of this watch a little bit later in the video. But I want to talk a little more about the history of this particular watch. And the model I have, and I'll show you some close-ups, has these sort of stubby indices, whereas, again, late 69, 70s, you have a more long, traditional style indice that you'd see in most watches today. And a lot of the early 60s, some of the early 70s watches will have these sort of stubby indices, and I like that look. So it's another reason why I went for it. The condition of this watch is quite good on the exterior. Okay, so the case itself is in very good shape. Very few scratches. The bevels still look good. The case back is excellent. Right? The case is in extremely good shape. And this watch does function fully. All the functions work. And that was something I gambled on, to be honest, in the auction. Because it was an online estate auction, and all they really tell you is that the watch is working. And by working, it means it's running. That's really all it means when you're looking at an auction like that. I only came with like 2 pictures. Okay, so, and they were not macro shots, so I could tell that the dial wasn't perfect and that there was, some discoloration in the alarm setting inner bezel, right? I could see all that, but I couldn't really tell the overall condition of the watch. I could tell that the case and case back and such were in good shape. And I thought, well, worst case scenario, if the functionality isn't all there, I could try and source another one on eBay and maybe swap the internals and use it with this case because the case was in such good shape. But fortunately for me, all the functions work. They don't work fantastic, but they work. And that's, kind of worry point 1. Worry point 2 is that my plans were, regardless of how well it ran, to take it to a local shop that I get the majority of my watch serviced and see if they could clean it up, or if necessary, get it running. Now, because I had all the functionality, I'm like, okay, I just want it cleaned up. So I thought, okay, I'll drop it off with them. And I kind of factored that into the price. I got a good deal on this because, again, it was an online auction with a variance of items. It wasn't just a watch auction. And that's something I would advise people to look for if you are into collecting watches, and specifically vintage watches. Look for auctions that aren't specifically watch related, right? If you can find a misplaced cartage auction, a antique items auction, right? You know, an estate sale like what I found, then quite often you're able to get a good deal on something like this, because not everyone there is looking for it, right? You're one of the few people that sees an interest and ends up bidding on it. So I factored in the fact that, I'm probably going to have to pay probably a couple of $100 to get this serviced. I dropped it off. You know, he told me he'd get back to me. About 48 hours later, they messaged me and gave me a call and said, you know what? It's running. It runs well. It runs within spec, which is impressive. It keeps very good time, to be honest. But they didn't really want to take the movement apart, because I specifically said, if you can't fully service it, just clean up the dial, clean it up a little bit, just to make it look a little more presentable up close. And they said they didn't want to do that because there are a number of, cogs and gears and levers and such that are a little worn due to age. And they didn't want to risk possibly taking it apart and having one of those break and then not being able to put it back to working order after. And they don't specialize in vintage. So I understood that that could be a possibility, and of course it is. So it remains to be seen if anyone local to me will be willing to work on this and get it back to the condition I'd like to see it in, right? I'm not talking perfect. I'm just talking clean and running as good as it is now. That's the reality of it. But to get to that dial and everything else to clean it up, you got to really take this thing apart. Now, I do have a vintage watch, two actual vintage watch service centers that are not that far from me. They're not, I'm located in Toronto. They're not in Toronto. There's one in Mississauga. There's one in Richmond Hill. So not that far out of the city. I'm going to take it to them and see what they quote me and see what they say. But I'm hoping I can get this to the condition I'd like to get it at for less than $300 Canadian. So say a couple $100 American, realistically. If I can get it there, I'll be very pleased with it. Very pleased. Because outside of a digital watch, mechanical alarms today, at any point, realistically, are expensive in a watch. They're very expensive. Probably the most famous mechanical alarm wristwatch today, really, the one that gets talked about the most, is the Bel Canto by Christopher Ward. And there you're looking at a, like a $5,000, 5,000 Canadian dollar watch, 5,000 American dollar watch, whatever it may be, right? It's a very expensive watch, and the primary feature is the fact that it has an alarm. Now, its alarm has a very different, very unique sound in comparison to what you would have found in a Seiko Bellmatic or a Vulcain Cricket or a Jaeger LeCoultre, a Memovox, or anything else. There's a few other companies that do them as well, but it's very different. So give them kudos for that, but we're talking a serious investment versus finding this in an estate sale auction. To me, it was a risk worth taking. And I'm very risk averse when it comes to watches. If you follow my channel, you know that before I buy a micro brand, I prefer to see it in person. And that's not very easy, right? Especially when you live in Canada and there are only a few Canadian micro brands. quite a number of the most recognizable micro brands are in Europe or Asia. So getting an opportunity to see some of these watches up close before I pull the trigger is, slim. And that's the same thing when it concerns vintage wristwatches. So I took a real gamble here, but I hope it's a gamble worth taking. Now let's get into the functionality of the Seiko Bellmatic, and this is specifically the 4006 7000 series model. So let's go over some of the functions of this particular movement because it's an impressive movement. And something that all of the early mechanical wristwatches had when it come to alarms is they had two springs, right? They had a main spring to actually control the functions of the watch, and they had another spring to control the functions of the alarm. And every company did it a different way. Now with Vulcain, they are a manual wound mechanical, right? They're not an automatic. So what they had is they had in their primary crown, the 3 o'clock position, if you wound it one way, you'd wind the main spring for the watch functions. And if you wound it the other way, you'd wind the spring for the alarm. With Jaeger-LeCoultre and a couple of the other watch manufacturers like Tudor eventually did a mechanical wristwatch with an alarm as well. They had the two, of course, crowns, although theirs was at the 3 and the 4 o'clock, and each one would wind a separate spring. Now, with Seiko, what they did is they got around the necessity of requiring two manually wound springs. Instead, they only use the rotor for winding the mainspring for the primary functions of the watch, whereas the crown is wound only for the actual alarm. So I'm going to begin with what you can do with the 3 o'clock crown. Now, one position out allows you to move that inner bezel to set the alarm. This is a 12-hour alarm, and the way it's set is like, for instance, if I put it here, it would go off at 2 o'clock. If I go about a quarter turn back, that'd be 1:45. That would be 1:30, 1:15, and of course 1, right? So that's kind of how you set it. Now, if you come out to the second position, this is where you can set the time, but it also has a quick set feature for the day of the week, and I'll show you how that works. So I'm going to go over, I'm going to roll past. Now what you're going to have here is you're going to have it turn over to Friday. Once it does, you can then roll back, and you're going to see it do a little kind of like hitch and resettle. Here it comes, hitching, resettles. Once it resettles, you can then go again past 12 to the next day, right? And you can just keep repeating that process until you get to the day of the week. There's the hitch, settle, and then roll back, and you're through, okay? Now let's say you don't want to have to roll through and through and through and through to change the date. What you have with the 2 o'clock crown is you have the ability to push it inward. You get a clicking motion that actually runs through the date. Right? So, I mean, the functions that are built into this particular movement are just excellent. When you consider that this is from 1969, the way the quick set features work, and the fact that you have all this functionality with just these two little crowns, it's amazing. Honestly, it's amazing. So now I'm going to go back to setting the alarm, and like I said, once I've set it, it takes about 10 winds. You'll feel it getting tight like any other mainspring. And then you pop this out, and that sets the alarm. So as you can see, when comparing this particular watch with my most abused watch being my Casio Duro, and my most worn watch being the Oceanus T200, the condition actually isn't all that bad. It really isn't. It only comes down to that dial, right? You've got the faded lettering, you've got the sort of stain around the center of the dial, kind of somewhat dirty indices, and of course the dirt around the outer bezel that, you know, sets the alarm, and maybe some dirt and some fading on the actual hands, but generally speaking, it's in really good shape. But something you've noticed probably right then and there, and that if you've watched my channel, you'll know this for a fact, is I rarely wear bracelets. I don't wear bracelets all that often. And I have quite a few watches that come with a bracelet. But generally speaking, the first thing I do when I get a watch with a bracelet is I remove the bracelet and replace it with a strap. Now, part of the reason for that is comfort. I find straps to be very comfortable. But if the occasion does sort of demand a bracelet, I'll put the bracelet back on, but then it comes off again right away. And the other part of the reason for that is bracelets get scuffed up, right? They're scratch magnets. That's just what they are. And because I like to keep my watches as mint as possible, I don't like wearing them with bracelets on them. Now, this bracelet is in pretty good condition, but it's got some scratches on the clasp, and it's got some scuffs, and the odd scratch on the bracelets itself. And because it came that way, it doesn't bother me to have it on. I'm not worried about adding any additional scratches because they're already there. It's not on me. And some of these vintage, especially Seiko bracelets, and trust me, it's not just Seiko. I've worn some vintage Tissot's that friends of mine have, and they all have these sort of jangly bracelets. But these jangly bracelets, honestly, they're pretty comfortable. They really are. It's not a highlight or anything, but I don't mind wearing them. And in a case like this where they're already scratched up, it doesn't bother me to have them on in case I buff them and bang them against something. So that's one of the advantages of actually buying vintage, is that you don't have to baby it if you're like me and you want to keep your watches in perfect shape, because they don't come in perfect shape. So it just remains to be seen as to whether or not I can get this dial all cleaned up and buffed back to a condition that really appeals to me. But something I've noticed while wearing this watch is that it honestly doesn't bother me while it's on. When I look down and check the time or check the date or what have you, I don't really notice it. The light's got to be bang on it for me to see any of the stains. And while I'm wearing it, it's not like anyone really notices it either. It just looks like a, well, pretty nice watch. So it's really just on me. It's on when I look at it closely or when I'm inspecting it that a condition can kind of irk me. But for those of you that are not too worried about condition, maybe don't treat your watches as delicately as I treat mine, buying vintage probably won't bother you all that much. It probably really comes down to the functionality, and in this case, the functionality, it's all there. So be sure to like and subscribe, follow the channel. If you want to find out what happens after the service, it'll be coming up. But I got a lot more coming up till then, and I'm already looking for a specific, well, a few actually vintage watches, but there's two that I'm really after. And I kind of have a line on one already. Hopefully I get it, and I'll be adding a review of that watch as well. So, till next time, hope you enjoyed the video, and look forward to seeing you back.